comes to mind when you hear the word apologetic? If you're like most people, you probably think of debates and polemical writings, arguments articulated to rationally defend a proposition. Well, that's certainly a component of apologetics. We would suggest that this is much too narrow of a definition. Our project on this podcast is to engage in a kind of cultural apologetic for the Anglican way. Through our stories, the stories of our guests, and the exploration of the richness of the literature, the liturgy, and the lifestyle of the Anglo tradition, we seek to present a compelling picture of the Church in England. You'll note that I specified the Anglican way rather than the Church of England. We're not advocating here a membership in the corrupt and liberal institution that currently enjoys the inherited status of the official church in the United Kingdom. Rather, we're speaking of the true church that has existed on the British Isles since at least the 2nd century and beyond.
What is the Anglican way? What we have in mind is broader than just the religious life of the English-speaking peoples. For what is wonderful about the English cultural tradition is that all is bound up together in a unified experience, a unitary life that permeates body and soul. Thus, to properly understand phenomena like the Anglican Church, we have to uncover, perhaps recover, and rehabilitate the cultural heritage of a broader way of living. Thus, our planned episodes will take us through the literary, aesthetic contributions, the political and social theory, and the religious life of the Church and her historical role in the drama that is English history. One of the recurring themes of this project will be that the Church itself was not something, for the English, that came down from the sky, unblemished by human experience. No, for the Church of England, it was born of English soil, well-rooted in the experiences, struggles, and triumphs of a people. These are things that we must remember in our present cultural moment.
If you've ever met or interacted with an Anglican in America today, it's likely that that individual was not born or raised Anglican, but was a convert to the Anglican way, and even more likely from a low church or evangelical background. I would presume further that that person, if he or she shared their reasoning for becoming an Anglican with you, they would not tell you that they did so because they were won over by a debate performance or by the rigid consistency of theological systemization. But rather, as Anglicans, we do not claim to have the perfect, airtight, systematic theology or formula that resolves every paradox or cures every doubt, but seek instead to present the Christianity formulated, practiced, and handed down by the English peoples. Why does this matter? Well, we're witnessing the increasing rootlessness and atomization of our society. However, life is not so compartmentalized as modern liberalism would have us believe. We cannot so easily separate our political, social, and economic, familial, and ecclesiastical life. The pragmatism and constant evolution that characterizes our political economy has bled into how we think about religion and family as well, with devastating effects. In an environment where innovation and relevance seem to be the leading concerns of the church in guiding our worship, our piety, and our polity, people are flocking to more historically rooted church traditions, whether they be Eastern Orthodoxy, Roman Catholicism, or even Anglicanism.
So, what is so special about the Anglo tradition and heritage that is worthy of our appreciation, adherence, and emulation? The answer is that, as Americans, We have actually been shaped by this tradition more than we even realize. There's a certain sense, a common sense to Anglicanism that resonates with those who come into contact with this tradition, even as Americans. This is the tradition that shaped the lawyers and the legal theorists and political geniuses who developed and articulated the English common law over many centuries. It shaped the poets and novelists that matured our collective imaginations, the theologians and pastors who taught the faith, and the common people who passed that faith down from generation to generation. This is our tradition.
And while some of the liturgy and the formality of Anglican worship might initially strike us as foreign in an age of novelty and spontaneity, there's also something that is strangely familiar in the practice, connecting us to generations of our forefathers for almost 2,000 years, much like returning home after a long journey. Regardless of where you are in your spiritual journey, we hope that you will join us on the way home on the Canterbury Trails.
Welcome to Canterbury Trails, a weekly walk through the faith and culture of our Anglo heritage.
O Lord, our Heavenly Father,
England is first and foremost for us a home.
That which we are.
Forth now, fear no darkness.
One equal temper of heroic hearts.
grant that all our doings may be ordered by thy governance.
It's the man who's only thinking about doing a good job or telling the truth who becomes really original.
Made weak by time and fate, but strong in will.
And then all the host of Rohan burst into song, for the joy of battle was on them.
To strive, to seek, to find.
Through Jesus Christ our Lord.
And not to yield.
You have got to be happy in those quiet moments when you remember that you are alive.
Amen.
Hi, I'm CJ Engel, and I live in Middle Tennessee, and I attend Whitleyville Reformation Church right here in Middle Tennessee.
Hi, and I'm Jared Lovell. I am ordained in the Reformed Episcopal Church as a deacon, and I serve Grace Anglican Church in Scranton, Pennsylvania. So, CJ, what is your story? How is it that you came to this point of exploring Anglicanism and appreciating the richness of the Anglo-cultural tradition?
Yeah, it's funny because, one of the things that you talked about in your opening was the fact that those of us who are interested in these more traditional ways of religious life actually don't come through it by reading systematic theology. It's not something that we open the text of the Bible and do some deduction work and reach these conclusions. It's actually something, I think, that results from a sort of a point of cultural despair. You look at the world around you and it is just chock full with ugliness, sexual depravity, all sorts of moral decay, and you just recognize the fact that the things that you hold dearly in your heart as a children are now only in your memory, and you recognize that our culture is basically involved in a sort of cult of cultural liquidation. I mean, that's what I would call it. And so when you come to the point where you're looking over this chasm and there's just the depths of almost a cultural hell below, you begin to rethink your approach to all of life. And you recognize the fact that our souls are nothing without some sort of cultural bedrock. So that includes things like our literary traditions. It includes our musical inclinations. It includes our aesthetic preoccupations. These are all things that actually fulfill the soul, and they minister to you. And when you lack these things within the cultural world at large, you realize that your faith is entering a crisis. And so I would say that I'm actually not unique in this way. I came from probably what at least half of our audience will have come from, which is a low church Congregationalist or Baptist. I happen to come from like a sort of a Calvary Chapel background in Northern California. And those things just seem so fleeting in the face of a cultural emergency. And so the apologetic that brings you back home, that allows you to enter onto the Canterbury Trails, is the fact that we are desperately seeking something that can tug at the heart in an age of soullessness. And so I would think that's a major part of my story. And so then you have to go back and you have to rethink your theological methodology, the way that you approach Scripture, the relationship between Scripture and the historical, ecclesiastical life, not only of the present day, but also of our forefathers. Where did these themes come from? And so this is one of those moments when, the modern systematization and the obsession with propositionalism and rationality, they actually gear one toward systematic theology. But when you begin to enter into older ways of thinking, things like historical theology begin to arise in your mind as predominant. And I think that's what happened to me. I think a lot of it was this shift in my focus from deduction and system and propositions and propositional perfectionism, and I jumped into what is the overall narrative of Christendom, And when you look at historical theology, suddenly there's much more meaning. You're entering your entire being into a drama, a historical drama, and that's where theology becomes alive. It's not something that enters your head and is filed away in perfect compartments, but it actually inflames the soul. And so I think these are the things that drive us forward. And when you begin to think like that, what happens to your theology is that you begin to leave the world of mental perfection and mental categorization, and you enter the world of cultural vitality, and you enter the world of Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, and these are even Lord of the Rings. It's we always heard growing up that those types of works were Christian in nature, but that doesn't mean it's like this gospel analogy. It means that he had a metaphysical view of world history that was Christian in nature. And you begin to realize that those are the stories and these literary bodies of work that we've passed down, the musical things that we have been handed, these are all theology. These are all theology that appeal to our senses. And I think that's specifically what draws people in. Now, of course, like you said, it's not just Anglicanism that's drawing people in, but it's the same thing. That need for narrative, that need for story is drawing people eastward. It's drawing people to Rome. It's drawing people to the Orthodox traditions. Obviously, I think that our traditions have to be rooted in our own cultural context. That's why Anglicanism is the most meaningful for me, and I think it should be the most meaningful for all of these other people that are, going to other traditions. I think Anglicanism actually has a lot more to offer in certain ways. But for instance, I sent this tweet out a couple weeks ago where I basically said that it makes one of the best apologetics for not joining Eastern Orthodoxy is because it has no relevance to our cultural context. Mm-hmm. I got hammered for that, but it actually makes sense. There's something that should ground you within the chain of your own being, So that's these are the things that have drawn me into this. So we're not just talking about, Anglican theology. We're talking about the Anglican vision of an entire world, an entire way of being, an entire civilization. That's what the Canterbury Trails are. It appeals to our material senses, and it appeals to our heart. And that's, I think, the journey that so many need to go down, and they need the rhetoric and the framing in order to, put something meaningful to the things that they're feeling. And I think that's what I want to do in this podcast.
Yeah, thanks. That's helpful. There's a lot of themes you touched on there. We're going to have to explore further later in this episode. My story is similar, but from a slightly different angle. I came from a similar background. I was born and raised Baptist. Although now that I think about it, was I really born Baptist? I don't know if you can be born Baptist because I was born pagan. And then not until you baptized can you really be, make a profession of faith, be a Baptist. So I was baptized at 13. So I was born pagan, raised Baptist in that framing of theology. Then I went down this shift towards part of the young restless reform movement, you might say, of the early 2000s, embracing 5-point Calvinism and then covenantal theology, and would have identified myself as a kind of Presbyterian, and then moved on to Anglicanism, which raised questions in some people's minds: am I going to keep going to Rome or to the East? But I was pretty confident when I became an Anglican that I wasn't going to go any further, and I had found something that where I knew I would be for the rest of my life. The reason for that was not so much a cultural despair that you described, but more of a formation issue, the question of formation. So it's related, though, in a sense, in terms of why do we believe, and what is it that drives belief and maintains us in the faith. And originally, I had always been interested in English history, and when I started studying the English Reformation just out of curiosity and interest as a hobby, one of the things I kind of kept myself at arm's length because of all the drama of the English Reformation, and thought, who would want a faith with all of that drama, Henry VIII and the divorces and all of the TV shows and movies that are made out of it? Wouldn't people prefer a purer confession where it was a bunch of theologians sitting down and very intentionally hammering out every doctrinal issue? But as I started studying the English Reformation more, I came to the conclusion that there's a whole lot more going on there than Henry VIII and his six wives and the divorce and the annulments and all of that. Even though Hollywood only wants to camp on that, there's actually much, much more to the story. And then it came down to the liturgy, the beauty of the liturgy, and the question of how is it that people are formed. And so one of the most influential books on my thinking at that time was by an author by the name of James K.A. Smith, who teaches at Calvin College. I wouldn't necessarily recommend all of his later works today, but his book Desiring the Kingdom was foundational for me in reframing how it is that we learn, how it is that our loves are formed and cultivated. And it's not, as you were talking about, simply through the recitation of catechism, not disparaging that at all. There's definitely a place for that. But that it is very possible to formulate a perfect systematic theology. I'm using perfect with the air quote sense there. And have a rational kind of faith only that you adhere to, but it does not inform your loves. It does not change your habits. And I was interested in how do we keep children. I was having children at the time, starting to have my first children. How do I raise my children? How do I keep them in the faith after seeing so many people my own age who had basically walked away from the faith to one degree or another? And so it became apparent to me that formation of habit was key to staying in the faith. And how are habits formed? How does liturgy contribute to the formation of our habits? Well, one thing that liturgy does is it allows us, to use the phrase you used, to enter into the story, to not just hear a lecture or to sing a song about something that is outside of you, but to allow you to enter into the narrative as well and act out in a way, which is what we do in our services, act out and repeat the gospel again and take our place within it. So that was really key to me. And the beauty was also another aspect that's worth a show in itself of the liturgy. But that's where I've settled, and I've been in this place for about the last 10 years and have pursued ordination, and I don't see myself going anywhere in the future.
So it's funny because like we refer to phrases like the Anglican tradition, like the English tradition. What's going on here? One of the things that I've been concerned about, and I think a lot of other people in my shoes isn't it kind of a LARP to talk about tradition in 21st century America? So what does our spiritual life have to do with tradition at all? Like, why does that matter anymore? Like that world has ended. We are so far away from the Elizabethan era. Why should we care, right? These are the things that I think about, and I think a lot of people kind of have in the back of their head when they talk about the concept of getting into the English tradition.
Well, I think it goes back to a doctrine of man. And who are we as human beings? So anthropology is a really important aspect of developing one's theology. Who are we as people? And the reality is that we are embodied creatures that are living in a physical world. Here you can cue Madonna, we're living in a material world. That's not what I mean, but that sometimes Christianity can be so focused on the spiritual that we lose our anthropology, that we lose what it means to be human. We lose, as a part of that, the implications of the incarnation, that Christ himself became a man. Not and this is also important. Jesus did not just become any man, somebody who could just fit anywhere. He actually became fully man, which means if we really think out the implications of that, what we would have to say is that Jesus was a specifically Jewish man who lived in Palestine, a particular place, at a particular time. So, first century AD is our time period. In a particular religious and political context. We confess this almost by rote and not even thinking about it in our creeds. It means something when we say that he was crucified, not just crucified, but crucified under Pontius Pilate. Why does Pilate get a reference in our creeds? Because it is a reminder that this is a historical religion that we adhere to, and we worship a historical Savior who enters into history with all of the implications of what that means, including living in a particular context and being crucified by on the order of a particular man, Pontius Pilate. And so, as human beings who are embodied creatures living in a physical world, we, like Jesus, need to appreciate the particulars of the place and the time and the culture and the context in which we live. That is what makes us human. Christianity is not a call out of the physical world to be more spiritual and be less human. It is a call to be more human.
Can I just jump in there real quick? We have somewhat of an outline here, but I see this all the time. And when you see, and some of what we're doing here is we're going to be pushing back on the evangelical pietism that kind of predominates the present evangelical mind. But you see this everywhere. I mean, we are called it's so many different layers to deny the natural and pursue the grace. These things, these two categories of grace and nature are antagonistic in the modern mind. Like as Christians, we are abandoning our created selves and entering into something sort of ethereal that doesn't actually exist, that has that the things around us, our obligations to family, our obligation to the visible church and in the visible church tradition, which, right, that's what we're talking about, tradition. All these things to them need to be crumbled down so that you can free yourselves to have a higher spiritual sense. And I think that's completely antithetical to the Anglican way.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I completely agree. And I think there's what you're touching on here. There's actually two sides to this sword. There is the one side that you referenced, which is the pietistical side, that kind of being called to a higher redemptive life rather than being truly human, truly a creature, and being spiritual. And that side has the positive of at least transcending to something higher, even if it is an error or a faulty way of thinking about it. But there's another side to this too when you separate these two realms, and that is you live your spiritual existence and believe that it has nothing to do with your physical world. So that's the liberal side of it. This is our listeners have probably heard of the Catholic Democrats who run for president or vice president, like our now former President Biden, who would say something like, as a Catholic, I believe this doctrine concerning, when life begins, and that's a matter of faith for me, but I don't let that confound my political views. I keep these things separate. So my point here is there's a double-edged sword to this dichotomy. There is the rise above the physical and be a more spiritual person, leave your humanity behind to a certain degree. And there's also that's maybe the conservative pietist side. And then the liberal side is, oh, I'm spiritual up here, but I don't let my faith trickle down into the earthiness, the worldliness, so to speak, and let it transform those things. Mm-hmm. So I would say that both of these are a mistake, in that real Christianity is the Christianity that becomes enculturated. It sinks deeply down into your bones. It takes on the form of the culture, not to be eaten up by the culture, but there are particular applications of Christianity that are unique to cultures, ways of remembering and reminding oneself of the faith, and that is where you get traditions.
Mm-hmm. It's funny because, like, that last bit there reminded me of something that was said recently about the people that put the "Not of This World" sticker on their car. They wear the "Not of This World" stuff. Those people, they have this category where the spiritual life has nothing to do with the world around us, but those people tend to be the most saturated in the culture around us, right? So in other words, even if you have this pietistic understanding of the religious life, you can't avoid donning some sort of religious culture onto you, because we are not just souls floating out there. We do have a context. And if you're not going to be conscious about adopting some sort of tradition, then you're going to basically don the wardrobe of the world in which you find yourself.
Yeah, that's right. And this is what always cracks me up when I see certain kinds of churches, certain kinds of evangelical churches, very modern, and the pastor is up there in, ripped jeans and, some kind of casual shirt with a narrow glass pulpit, which is very bougie, very modern, very innovative, and a nice mic on and a screen behind, and all of these things talking about how they are not of this world. They're not shaped by any particular tradition, and right. They are just focusing on the spiritual while they preach from their iPad. And so technology is just one great example of this. The idea that if we just shut out various traditions and be more spiritual, that we won't be shaped by the physical world around us is just nuts. Oftentimes, technology, as I said, is a great example where we look at screens all day now. Mm-hmm. And so we as pastors, we prepare our sermons on screens, and we read books on screens, and we write emails, and then we project a screen, and we say, the screen has done nothing to change me or for me, even as we're looking at our phones and using all the latest apps. And the phone is a great example. The iPhone's a great example, where the immediacy of the phone, this little computer you can hold in your hand, basically trains your brain to think that the world is just always going to be at your fingertips. Everything I need is here. What are my restaurant choices? How do I navigate? Where are my appointments? All of my contacts, my social media, any information I want about anything is right here. Now, take that phone away. Imagine just trying to live without your iPhone for a day. I guarantee you, almost all of us are going to experience probably multiple times throughout the day where we become impatient because we got to stop and look something up, or can you imagine looking through the yellow pages for someone's number? Or we're going to be impatient. We're going to feel like we're living with an arm tied behind our backs, if not more, and saying, how can I function? Well, that's because we've been formed by just a little piece of technology we can hold in our hands, but all the while claiming we are out of this world, we're separate from this world, we're spiritual people. And so the reality is we are going to be formed in one way or another. We cannot avoid it. And so the tradition, the importance of tradition is recognizing that the modern liberal narrative, that there's this neutral space that we can just kind of put ourselves in a bubble, and as long as the state stays neutral and everybody else stays politically neutral, that we can form ourselves and do it almost by accident or avoid formation. And the reality is you're always going to be shaped by a tradition. Maybe we should be a little more intentional about the tradition we allow to shape us.
Mm-hmm. And I like that too, because you don't have to get into the sort of the cop-out argument of technology where you can say like, well, it's just neutral. It just depends on how you apply it. I think that has a very optimistic view of man, basically. That man is actually controlled by technology, but he doesn't actually. He has a sense of hubris about him, where he thinks he can control technology, wherein the reality is that technology controls us. And this is why tradition is important. This is why liturgy is important, because in a sense, the liturgy is actually training us. It's training us on how to be pious and how to think about the world appropriately and how to behave appropriately. It is a training mechanism. And when you have a neutral view of things like technology, what you're denying is all of the contributions of a liturgical view of life, where these are the things that shape man, that man is not the creator of worlds and that man is not the creator of and manager of technology, but is rather downstream from these things that we choose. And so I think that's one of the things that I want to sort of tease out as well over the, there's all of the things that we're talking about could have an episode of their own, but I think that's one thing that's very important to me. But one thing you touched on at the beginning, or both of us did, was this idea of theological systematization, right? So what does that mean for someone who is trying to unlearn the 20th century? Like what is, like, we actually live in a world. I was thinking about this the other day, that like we're trying to oppose like DEI and some of these left-wing activist things, but we're actually falling back into 20th century modes of thinking, where it's all about managerialism, and it's all about like even the concept of a meritocracy, right? Where you take the most efficient workers and you choose him because he's the most efficient and he's the best capable of adding to the GDP. And so like we're always into systematizing things at all times. It's all about efficiency. It's all about logic and deduction and all these things. These older ways of thinking about not just religious life, but just being in general, that is all opposed to the very mode of thinking, the very 20th, even the 19th century mode of thinking. And so when we talk about things like tradition, but also aesthetic theology, like what role does aesthetics have in preaching to us? I don't think that the modern age is very good at dealing with those things, and we need to uncover and recover them.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I would also say that there needs to be a careful balance here. You referenced in the opening that how you moved away from systemization and just pure rationality, pure trying to deduce your conclusions from premises. And I briefly touched on that as well. And I want to make a clarification at this point, which is that we are not, there are perhaps people who are listening to this that might think we're talking about Anglicanism as a sort of vibe or feeling, right, or just purely an aesthetic or a mystery that makes us feel a certain way. That's not what we're saying. So while we are trying to push back on the idea that a perfect systematic theology is what converts people and what maintains people within a tradition, to live a faithful life, while we're pushing back against that, we also want to push back against the idea, and I think you actually used the word earlier, of LARPing, of play acting Anglicanism, where we get all dressed up in our robes and we pretend it's kind of an escapist experience for us to leave the modern world and pretend we are something else. And we don't really have beliefs. We just have feelings about those things. And so we also want to push back against that as well. And it's something that is a real danger. There are, whether it's in people who are converting to Eastern Orthodoxy or Roman Catholicism or Anglicanism, those who are simply seeking an escape from maybe their fundamentalist evangelical backgrounds, where they don't like the idea of doctrine because it's divisive, or because there are political commitments maybe attached to their fundamentalist upbringing, and so they want the liberation of not being bound by doctrine anymore. And so they see an out in an historic tradition that, and their idea of it is, well, we just do liturgy now. We don't actually have doctrine anymore. We don't have statements of faith. And it's so freeing because now I can join the historic church, do liturgy, and be pro-gay marriage or something like that. And that's not what we're talking about here. We're not talking about having theology that is divorced from logic. I teach logic. I'm a classical teacher. I am all about logic. I'm not disparaging it. What I'm doing, though, what I think we're doing, is making a distinction between what draws someone in and keeps someone in the faith versus what pulls them out of it. We're not saying, therefore, your Christianity should be divorced from logic. It's just that logic, coherence, and systemization is not what draws people in and keeps them.
Yeah, I mean, I would echo that, wholeheartedly. When we talk about theological systemization, I'm not against systems. I think that's a key part of the historic faith. I mean, even the creed has propositional statements that need to be assented to, right? But I think what happens when we begin to hone in on that, and we begin to push down the effects of developing the whole man, and we begin to forget the fact that Christian culture doesn't just mean that we have a Hobby Lobby and put verses on cheap goods from China, right? That there actually is a Christian culture, and there is a cultus, and that we need to foster those things because man is a holistic being. And what happens when we begin to focus only on the system and the propositions is the body itself decays. And I think that's how you can explain our cultural crisis.
Yeah, right. I think, while well-intentioned, some of the Christianizing of culture that has characterized different movements over the past 20, 30, 40 years, it has been misguided in the sense of trying to Christianize by putting the bumper sticker on. So how do I make this car a Christian car? Well, you just put the bumper sticker on, right? You just put a label, and you're
putting propositions. You're putting propositions on the car.
Right, exactly. Yeah, and we've seen this with music and a whole host of examples we could draw on, where to Christianize it is just to put a label over the top of it, when we don't want to say the reaction. Let me put it this way: the reaction to that is we can't Christianize anything. Only the church is Christian, so keep these two things separate. And so don't try to Christianize anything. I think that's the wrong approach as well. In reaction to the Christianizing via bumper sticker mentality, there is a way of Christianizing, but it is much more deeply rooted than that. To your point, it's not about just putting a proposition on it. It is about a practicing it in a certain way, in a repeated way, in a duplicable way that is passed on and that is inherited. That is the tradition element. So again, as Protestants, we tend to be a little leery of tradition over against Scripture. But instead of thinking of tradition as this alternative authority that competes with the Bible, I think we need a new definition there. That tradition is simply the practice of Christianity. You take the propositions, you take the theology, and you implement it, you practice it, you repeat it over and over, until it gets deeply ingrained in us and comes out through different cultural practices and customs. And so that's the tradition. I think we should recover that word as Protestants rather than thinking, oh, that's tradition. We don't like tradition. We're Protestants. We just have the Bible. Well, that Bible needs to come into us somehow and be lived out somehow, more than just through a bumper sticker. And that is what tradition, that is what lived Christianity is.
Yeah. I want to broaden this a little bit. We wanted to call this Canterbury Trail. Obviously, Canterbury Trails is a head nod to Canterbury Tales. So, what are we driving at there? Why did we have a literary reference? Why do we have a Chaucer reference? What about the Anglican way is, draws us to it in terms of its cultural contributions to the Western world? Like, there's something broader than just, like you said in the beginning, the Church of England. Obviously we're going to get into religious history and religious conflict and theology and things like that too. But we've talked about this, before we started recording, that we want to delve deep into the contributions of Chesterton and Tolkien and Lewis, and these people aren't really contributing to systematic theology. So why do they matter?
They matter because, and let me back up even just a second to, you started off the question by referring to the podcast. Yeah, one of the things we're getting at here and relating it to, Canterbury Tales being the literary reference, is that this is not simply a podcast about Anglicanism. This is not going to be a prolonged and extended theological conversation about what is within Anglicanism, what is not, or even commenting on the issues of Anglican politics today and what's going on throughout the world. I think there are plenty of podcasts for that. What we seek to do here, in kind of tying this into the broader Anglo tradition, is recognizing the fact that the English tradition has provided a series of pillars that created a whole world for the Anglican Church to flourish. An example of this would be Tolkien himself. Now, I realize Tolkien is a Roman Catholic, and so he's not precisely Anglican. But
he is Anglo.
What's that?
But he is Anglo. He is Anglo.
That's right.
Yeah.
And so he breathes the same air to a certain extent. So when Tolkien wrote The Lord of the Rings, he did not just tell a story about Frodo or about Aragorn or about anyone else. He created a whole world. And he took his time with that. One of the things that I most appreciate about reading the first book of The Lord of the Rings is just how slow the progress is in the storytelling compared to what you see in the movie. That he takes his time creating this world, creates a whole language for that world. And so what he has done, and why he attracts so many fans, generation after generation, is he's painted such a broad picture where you can see scenes like the Shire, okay? Or things that remind you of the Shire. It's not precisely the Shire, but I've seen the pictures of, country life, kind of simple living, and say, ooh, it has a Shire feel. Oh, that reminds me of Tolkien. Why? Because he's painted a much broader world for you. He did not give you just a character and talk about that character's struggle to get to their destination. He's built out a whole world with its own language, its own aesthetic, or multiple aesthetics, whether it's Mordor or whether it's the Shire or whether it's Gondor. And so he's built out this world that you can enter in and you can experience what's going on around you as you put the characters in their setting. And furthermore, not only has he built the world out in terms of breadth and detail, but he's created a whole backstory that even a lot of Tolkien fans have not read the whole backstory of all of the volumes going on, and you have to be a really dedicated fan to get all of those works under your belt. So there's its own history, its own language, its own aesthetic, and even various places have their own aesthetic, and you can appreciate them for what they are. You can appreciate each one for its own little place, whether it is the Shire, whether it's Gondor, or Lothlorien, or any of these places. And so Tolkien has created a world that is much broader than the character. That's my point. In the same way, why does he do this? Because I think he appreciates in the Anglican, I'm not using that capital A there, tradition, what English culture has provided a world as well, that the church is just a part of.
Right.
And so you have these all literary reference points. You have all kinds of heroes within the culture and all kinds of great stories that provide pillars that support the church. And these are places where you can attach yourself. So these are maybe there are people who become Anglicans simply because they have read a story by Lewis. And so, I mean, there was someone visiting my parish a few weeks back who was visited a couple times since, and they came in, and I introduced myself and asked where they're from and what brought you here, and they said, I read Lewis. I was Roman Catholic, but I've been reading Lewis. And so that's the angle, the avenue in. And Lewis is just, we've been saying Lewis and Tolkien a lot, but that's the tip of the iceberg just in the 20th century, right? It goes way back, way further than that. I mean, you could go back to the King Arthur and the King Alfred and the Robin Hood stories. All of these things, the church is in the background. The characters, there's characters in there that are part of this church that leak at Jane Austen. All of these authors are tied in, and they provide, like like Tolkien does in The Lord of the Rings, more than just a set of propositions or a character and their own personal struggles, but a whole world. And so that, I think, is also really valuable to the tradition as well, is that you have these points of entry. And when we, through this podcast, are talking about the Anglican way, we don't want to exclude these other cultural references. So we want to have conversations about the literature that also contributed to forming the people who pass the faith on to the next generation in this tradition.
Yeah, it's funny, like you mentioned the fact that the Church of England was born of the soil of the Englishness of a given people, right? And so, like, what we're doing when we talk about Anglicanism is we're actually digging deep into our own. There's something there that we've inherited that we're trying to identify, because I think, like, you talk about the Shire. It's interesting, like, looking at, like, if you watch the movie or read the book or whatever, either one. If you look into Tolkien's experiences in England and how they basically flowed through his mind and entered into his pen, right? And that's the way he came up with these worlds. So these worlds that he created were not ex nihilo. They were actually born of his imagination, which was fostered as a child.
Right.
So there's a certain, not just a certain, but there's a strong Englishness to the literature that we love today. Today we could recognize it. Like, if you saw something like any quotation from Jane Austen or Charles Dickens, you wouldn't need to know that it was them writing it to know that that's an English thing that's being described here. So there's something deeper beyond the words themselves that we can tap into in order to live as more holistic human beings. And I think that's what I love about this experience. This really is a journey. This really is a path that we've decided to take as individuals, for sure, but also with our families. And I think as a culture, some of us that are beginning to be more traditionally minded, and it's a lot of work, by the way, to be traditionally minded in the present age. In fact, you have to use technology like we're doing now in order to help you along that journey. And there's a certain tragedy about that. I think that's an irony, actually, that people have dealt with for hundreds of years, is the tragedy of needing to partake in some of these things in order to remember, to collectively remember, to reawaken something that's buried deep within our souls. I mean, that's one of the things that I've learned to appreciate, is the fact that even I, as an individual, am more than just 1990 to 2024. I'm something beyond that, and you can feel it. You're tapping into something that's there. There's something spiritual that continues on from generation to generation, and I think that's what's going on here too. I think as a society, we have sort of peered over the ledge, and we see where it's all going, and it's not the world of AI, the wonderful promises that are made to us about utopian futures. We know there's a dark end to that path, and so it is a journey, and it is a journey. We don't think in terms, and I think this is something that we want to emphasize too. We don't think in terms of wishing we could turn back the clock or recreating, the 1580s or something like that. This is not where we're at. We have to deal with the present, but man, we could use some guidance right now, and what better guidance than our forefathers?
Yeah, absolutely, and so there's a lot relating this back to the Anglican tradition. You briefly referenced this earlier, that if we were to answer the question, so why Anglicanism? Why Anglicanism over Eastern Orthodoxy or over Roman Catholicism? Well, I'm not trying to be judgmental of those who have gone those various paths. But the reality is and you've said it, I think, a couple of times now, and that is, this is our culture.
Yes.
And there is a certain irony, I think, to the, say, evangelical, low church evangelical, who is starting to feel this sense of rootlessness and being overtaken by pragmatic concerns, especially within their church experience, and not feeling like they're tied into to the history of the church or the liturgy or the aesthetic of the church has created in the West, and they, in response to that, decide to then abandon, in a sense, their culture entirely and become Eastern Orthodox. And now, again, there are I respect Eastern Orthodox people. I'm not trying to, lob a grenade in that direction or pick a fight there. But the idea of deeply English formed people, whether we realize it or not, recognizing we are separated from our tradition, want to get back into contact with that, and say the best way to do that is to find a tradition completely foreign to our culture, to our institutions, and say, now I feel more rooted and grounded, and I have a tradition because I've adopted one that is from the East in this case, or more Roman, okay? And so I think there's something natural about English people, American people, who have inherited almost all of our institutions from England, and this was in our cold open as well. Our legal institutions, our literary heritage, a lot of these things have been inherited from England. It would be more natural to embrace a tradition that is fostered in that same environment, that is not foreign to us, that allows us to continue to be as human beings without completely changing our life or adopting the product of another culture. So here's just one example of this for people to think about. If you enjoy reading your Bible in the vernacular, in the English, some of you out there who are KJV onlyists, who like your King James Version Bible, where do you think you got the ability to read that Bible? It was from the English people. And it's not because they were just part of, a Reformation and everybody was writing their own translations. It is something deeply ingrained. This is a podcast for another time, perhaps. But deeply ingrained in the English culture was the idea we need a Bible in our vernacular. So it's not the Reformation where you first get the Bible in English. You get parts of the Bible translated by King Alfred, who thought it was important that they have the Bible in their own language, even in the Middle English of the time. It was John Wycliffe, the morning star of the Reformation 150 years before, who is translating the Bible into English. Of course, then there is William Tyndale during the time of the Reformation, who is probably the greatest contributor to that product in giving us the Bible we have today. But what's really interesting about Tyndale is his project is not simply to give us an English Bible. There's a great biography of Tyndale out there entitled "The Man Who Gave God an English Voice." Because what Tyndale does is not just give us an English Bible, he creates so many English words and phrases that become part of our very language. And so there's actually two different biographers of Tyndale who have said that the two most important contributors to the English language are William Tyndale and William Shakespeare, and Shakespeare comes in second. And so William Tyndale doesn't just spiritually transfer the text of the Latin Vulgate or the Greek Septuagint to English. He gives us words and phrases that are repeated, that today, without even thinking about it, that form categories in our minds for how we think. Our thoughts that we form are a product of language as well. The way, if you just think about this at a practical level, certain words have certain detonations and negative connotations as well, positive and negative. That if you use two words, they might be mean the same thing, might be almost the same word, but one has a very negative connotation. You wouldn't use that word. One has a very positive connotation, and so words shape how we think. And so the thinking in English is a thing.
Yeah.
And so we get that from English translators that help us to formulate our theology. So this goes back to one of our original points. The idea that we just do theology through systems, devoid of this cultural context. Well, your doing theology in English presupposes a certain context in how you're communicating and articulating these ideas.
Yeah, this is funny because this reminds me of my own recent experience. In California, I went to a church that had adopted the MacArthur's LSB version, and it's funny because like take a verse like Psalm 23, right? The Lord is my shepherd, and you're repeating these words that my great grandfather was in World War II, and he had this Bible, and he had his little pocket Bible that they sent to the army. Isn't that crazy? They sent the army out with Bibles, but he had this little, he had his Psalm 23 was highlighted, and you just read it. It's King James, like everything was. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not. And you read that, and then he gives that to his son, who reads and memorizes that. And we have this multi-generational, in the King James language, beautiful prose of Psalm 23 that's passed on from generation to generation. And now, through our sophistication and heightened research and expertise and new documents, we have a highly technical translation. And so we get this LSB Bible, and my kids are learning to read it, and it says, Yah is my shepherd. And it's like, suddenly we have this break. Because of our expertise, they don't repeat the same rhythm and tone and cadence as has been passed on from generation to generation. And, a lot of people might be thinking, you're overthinking this or whatever, but I think that's a very meaningful aspect of what we're talking about. That these are things that are passed on from generation to generation, and the verses matter, and the English prose matters, and the things that we've been handed, they really do matter. So I think that kind of just bolsters, some of the earlier points that you made.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And so, moving forward, what we would like to do is expand on a lot of the particulars of this topic. So throughout this podcast, there are lots of pieces of English music, English hymns, English poetic and prosaic works. English spirituality is a rich topic that is worthy of exploration as well. How did the English people see themselves as Christian? and how did they remind themselves of the faith and live out the faith. What is surprising is that not every Christian around the world finds the same mechanisms to do this or uses the same images. And just to give you a quick example, think of being a Christian in a desert environment, or a Christian in a meadow environment, or an Arctic environment. Your surroundings are going to play a part in every aspect of your life. The kinds of jobs that you pursue when you live near a place that is oil rich versus a place that has no water, versus a place that is really hot versus a place that's very cold. Different metaphors are going to be used. Different figures of speech are going to enter your vocabulary. You're going to perform different jobs, and you can't actually keep your Christianity separate from all of those things. Mm-hmm. And so what we're going to find is this is true in the British Isles as well. That the British tradition is not just a repetition of dogmatic Christianity that you can find anywhere. It is lived out through particular geographical circumstances, historical circumstances, different wars going on that shape how people have practiced the faith, remembered their faith, and handed it down. And so that is what we seek to explore further here on Canterbury Trails.
Thank you for joining us this week on Canterbury Trails. If you like what you hear, we'd appreciate your support by liking, sharing, and subscribing on whatever platform you're hearing us. Stay tuned for more weekly episodes, and we'll see you next time on the Canterbury Trails.